He had been in office less than 3 years, but they were 3 of the most difficult years any president had faced. Conflict simmering since the Civil War, crisis after crisis with the Soviet Union, the constant threat of nuclear war through it all. John F. Kennedy had proven himself to be a tough, pragmatic, and charismatic leader. Few laws were passed that bore his name, but he had inspired people, especially young people. He was in Texas looking to the future, to the campaign for re-election and the chance to create a legacy. He wanted his wife, Jacqueline, with him in Texas. The First Lady captivated Americans. She was one of his greatest political assets. On November 22nd, 1963, they reached Dallas. The president was here to be heard and seen and touched by the people who had come to admire him in the last 1,000 days. But there was another side to John Kennedy that the public never saw and probably could not imagine, a side that he kept secret.
President Kennedy liked to live on the edge. He liked to take chances, and I think he was walking on the edge of issues that were dark and dangerous.
Interesting to me to think in retrospect whether or not, in light of today, he would have gotten away with what he got away with. He got away with an awful lot.
There are 2 Jack Kennedys. There's the good Jack Kennedy, who was young, he was articulate, he talked about peace, he talked about racial justice, he supported his brother fighting organized crime. It's the one everybody knew. And there's a bad Jack Kennedy. And the bad Jack Kennedy was a very reckless man.
There were people loyal to the president who knew well the risks he had taken. But on November the 22nd, 1963, there were others whose silence could not be guaranteed, who knew secrets that could destroy his presidency. In Germany, on a secluded farm, a young woman was in hiding. There were allegations that she was a spy who had slept with the president. In Paris, an official in the Cuban government was meeting with Kennedy's CIA to plot the murder of Fidel Castro. In Washington, the FBI director knew that the president had always lived a double life. He believed John Kennedy was putting his presidency in danger. In Chicago, one of the nation's most powerful criminals who had helped to get Kennedy elected believed he had been betrayed by the president and his family. In Los Angeles, the FBI was hounding a woman who'd been Kennedy's lover. She feared having to reveal their secrets. Throughout his life, John Kennedy could count on one man to be his protector, his father, Joseph P. Kennedy. But a debilitating stroke had reduced this powerful man to a helpless witness. It was here in Hyannis, Massachusetts, at the Kennedy family compound, that Joe Kennedy learned the fate of his son.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of gunshot wound in the brain.
Millions of people all over the world were stricken with grief when Kennedy was murdered. But no one could comprehend how deep was the grief of Joseph Kennedy. It was his dream that died in Dallas.
Dangerous World, The Kennedy Years. Now from New York, Peter Jennings.
Good evening. Tonight we're going to take a new look at the life of President John F. Kennedy. Tragically, the moment of the Kennedy presidency we most remember was its last. It was his violent and sudden death which has been most difficult for us to understand, and it remains a profound mystery. We're not going to solve that mystery tonight. But we will help explain why so many questions about President Kennedy's death have gone unanswered. We believe the answer lies in his life, and most importantly, in the parts of his life that have been kept secret. It is a major undertaking to explore some of the tough questions about Kennedy's public and private life. To do this, we have collaborated with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, who has just published a book about Kennedy called The Dark Side of Camelot. The John Kennedy we have encountered was a man who led this country with intelligence and vision and restraint, but also a man who lived his life with a recklessness that is hard to comprehend and impossible to ignore. Our report begins with the man who shaped John Kennedy more than any other, his father. Joseph Kennedy was a profoundly ambitious man. At 26, he was America's youngest bank president. By 35, he'd earned millions on Wall Street. At 40, he'd become a Hollywood mogul and one of the country's most prominent Irish Americans. Throughout his rise to fame and riches, there were suspicions that part of his large fortune came from bootlegging, that he'd been in business with organized crime. There was talk that he was an unfaithful husband, that the image he projected of a proud family man surrounded by beautiful children and a beautiful wife masked a darker reality. But the rumors did nothing to halt his rise. In 1938, he became ambassador to Great Britain, where he positioned himself to realize his greatest ambition, to become America's first Catholic president. But during World War II, he urged accommodation with the Nazis, and the public turned against him. And so, for the rest of his life, Joe Kennedy would devote himself to capturing the presidency for one of his sons. July the 15th, 1960, the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. Joseph Kennedy's son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, had just won the Democratic presidential nomination. At 43, he was one of the youngest presidential candidates in American history. And here he celebrated his triumph.
Let me say first that I accept the nomination of the Democratic Party.
Watching John Kennedy in Los Angeles, it was hard to imagine that he was once a reluctant young candidate.
Jack was not like his daddy. He wasn't burned up with the idea of being in politics. He wanted to be a writer. His whole ambition was to become a great biographer or writer.
But in 1946, he agreed with his father to run for Congress from Massachusetts.
Glad-handing people and kissing babies was not a comfortable thing for him. So that he gave up quite a lot when he went into politics. But once having tasted it, I think then he wanted to go for the pinnacle. That was the way he'd been trained, to go for the first. And his father, of course, was pressing it too.
Joe Kennedy directed and financed 5 Massachusetts campaigns for his son. In John's first race for the Senate in 1952, he received a last-minute newspaper endorsement after his father promised to lend the publisher $500,000. With his campaign manager, his brother Robert, at his side, John Kennedy celebrated their victory.
Well, I guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Bobby? I am, Jack. Okay.
By the time he was nominated for president, Kennedy had become a disciplined and self-assured political performer.
We stand at a turning point of history, where we will witness not only new breakthroughs in weapons of destruction, but also a race for mastery of the sky and the rain, the ocean and the tides, the far side of space, and the inside of men's minds. That is the question of the new frontier. That is the choice that our nation must make.
Words and ideas could carry moments like this.
Between the fresh air of progress and the stale, dank atmosphere.
But beyond the confines of the Los Angeles Coliseum, the rest of America would not be so easily won. John Kennedy had to do what no one had done before, convince Americans in every part of the country to accept a Catholic as president. No one doubted that the election would be close. No one who knew Joseph Kennedy doubted that he would do whatever it took to win. The election of 1960 was expected to be close. Senator Kennedy had to overcome doubts about his youth and his religion. Strange as it may seem today, many Americans feared that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope. In Kennedy's favor, he had charm, eloquence, and a very strong political organization. But the Kennedy family didn't believe that was enough. You're about to hear from first-hand witnesses who tell us that the Kennedys made a deal with one of the most powerful criminals in America in the hope that they could guarantee an election victory. September the 26th, 1960. John Kennedy came to Chicago to debate his Republican opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon. The debate was to be televised. 75 million people were expected to watch. Nixon had served for 8 years under a very popular president, Dwight Eisenhower. Many Americans saw Nixon as more qualified than Kennedy.
Mr. Nixon and I disagreed. I voted in favor of that proposal.
But from the moment the debate began, it was clear to those watching that Kennedy was outperforming his opponent.
One party is ready to move in these programs, the other party gives them lip service.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
Nixon appeared uneasy and defensive.
That's the question before the American people. And
Kennedy appeared to be relaxed and confident.
What you want this country to be.
John Kennedy became the first politician in America to harness this new force in American political life. But here in Chicago, there was another force at work on Kennedy's behalf, an older, darker force, organized crime. Chicago was home to the wealthiest and most powerful crime syndicate in America. Its members were the heirs of the notorious bootlegger Al Capone. They referred to themselves as the Outfit. They were Chicago's shadow government.
The mob was a huge factor in Chicago. They could control a large section of the police department. They had their hands in politics. They could do almost anything they wanted to. They were kings, really.
Joe Kennedy knew how Chicago worked. It was here that he owned and operated the centerpiece of the Kennedy family fortune, the Merchandise Mart, the largest commercial building in the world. He understood that in Chicago, the Outfit was more than just a criminal enterprise. It was also a political power whose reach extended far beyond Chicago. In half a dozen cities, through extortion, bribery, and violence, the Outfit controlled labor unions with thousands of members, unions which could deliver money, campaign workers, and votes, assets of enormous value to anyone running for office. The new boss of the Chicago Outfit, the man who commanded this corrupt power, was Sam Mooney Giancana.
No one promoted Giancana because they liked his blue eyes or his personality or anything like that. It was because he had simply killed enough people that he moved up through the mob and eventually got to the top. As a boss, if there were a problem, he'd listen to a very brief description of the problem and then say, hit him, hit him. He was, in almost every respect, a savage.
Giancana's toughest adversary was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. During the late 1950s, the FBI was conducting the most aggressive investigation of the Chicago Mafia in its history.
By the time 1960 rolled around, there was a great intensity of pressure on the organized crime in Chicago. Then we would follow them, the mobsters, knowing that they knew we were following them. But that kept them from doing many of their activities because they knew the FBI was on top of them at all times.
All of the goons around Giancana were all concerned about pressure from the FBI. The agents were around there all the time and were surveilling him night and day. And Giancana was absolutely outraged. He went on and on with cursing and hollering and complaining that this country was like Russia.
Sam Giancana had a problem that he believed only a president or his attorney general could fix. There have long been suspicions that the Chicago boss played a secret role in the 1960 elections. He talked about helping the Kennedys in conversations that were secretly recorded by the FBI. But now, there is evidence of a deal between the mob and the Kennedys to influence the 1960 elections. Evidence that through the use of trusted intermediaries, Joseph Kennedy mounted a coordinated effort with the mob to swing votes to his son. The deal is believed to have originated during a secret meeting in this Chicago courthouse between Joe Kennedy and Sam Giancana. It took place in the winter of 1960. The sensitive task of arranging the meeting is said to have been handled by a Chicago Circuit Court judge, William Toohey. He was a trusted friend of Joe Kennedy. Judge Toohey's role has remained secret until now.
Toohey knew that I was representing a certain element in the city, and I received a call from Bill Toohey. And he said, I don't know how to pose this question. He said, do you know Mooney Giancana? I said, yes, I've met Mr. Giancana, but again, I'm not intimate with him. He said, how do you suggest that I arrange a meeting between Mr. Giancana and Joseph Kennedy?
In 1960, Robert McDonald was a lawyer who defended many members of the outfit. Years before, he had served as a state prosecutor, and he still enjoyed good relationships in the legal establishment. Judge William Toohey was a friend and a mentor. One night, McDonald went to the Armory Lounge, Giancana's headquarters.
I met with Mooney in the back, and Mooney asked me what it was all about. I said, I have no idea. He said, can you more or less guarantee that this will be a very, very private meeting? I said, I'm not in control, but I'll certainly tell the principals that it must be private. 2 days later, I went to Judge Toohey's chambers. I got there about 5. Courts were just getting out, and there I met Joe Kennedy. And I would say within 20 minutes, a half an hour, we could hear the footsteps coming into the empty courthouse, the darkened courthouse. And I opened the chamber's door and signaled for Mooney Giancana to come in. I thereupon made the introductions, and then Judge Toohey and I both left. Now, I have no idea what agreements were made, what promises were made or kept or unkept. That I do not know.
But there is another mob insider who says she did learn what promises had been made, a person speaking publicly for the first time, who reports that a deal was proposed that would give Giancana relief from the pressure of the FBI.
The guarantee was that the investigators would lay off of the outfit if Kennedy got in. That was the assurance Sam got from Joe Kennedy.
Jean Humphreys wanted to be photographed in shadow. She was married to one of the highest-ranking members of the Chicago outfit, Murray the Camel Humphreys. Sam Giancana needed Humphreys' connections to execute any plan to help Joe Kennedy. For decades, Humphreys had been the man who managed the outfit's dealings with businessmen, labor leaders, and politicians. When Humphreys heard about Joe Kennedy's proposition, Humphreys' reaction was not positive.
Murray came home from a meeting one night. He said, that Sam is nuts, or words to that effect. And I said, what now? And he said, he's talking about getting that Joe Kennedy's kid elected president. I laughed. He sort of laughed. And my husband was very much against it, because he thought Joe Kennedy was a crook. He was a bootlegger and couldn't be trusted. You see, Joe Kennedy had pulled some double cross. He had sold some liquor to the outfit and then hijacked his own load that he'd already been paid for and took it and sold it somewhere else. So that's why Murray called him a double-crosser, and I think that's why Murray was very much against the Kennedy thing.
To push the Kennedy thing through, Giancana needed the approval of the mob's senior leaders. They included 2 retired bosses and Murray Humphreys. According to Jean Humphreys, they voted on Joe Kennedy's proposition.
They all decided to go for it except Murray, and then, of course, he was the one that had to do all the fixing.
Fixing, in this case, meant that Humphreys had to line up mob-controlled unions to support Kennedy.
Labor racketeering was Humphrey's stock and trade, and arranging through labor unions to swing votes for Kennedy in Kansas City and Milwaukee and other places that was well within the limits of Humphrey's capabilities.
But Humphrey's capabilities were put very much to the test because the Kennedys had damaged their standing among many in organized labor. Both John and Robert Kennedy had been active on a Senate committee which investigated mob-controlled unions.
This is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion.
Mr. Harper, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that...
Senator Kennedy was a member of the committee. His brother Robert was the chief counsel. Joe Kennedy was worried about the committee's attacks on prominent labor leaders. He feared the defection of traditionally Democratic Union voters could spell defeat for his son.
I'm talking about the people you surrounded yourself with.
It became Murray Humphrey's job to help the Kennedys overcome this political liability. According to Gene Humphreys, Chicago's Conrad Hilton Hotel was the site in July and October 1960 of a series of secret election meetings run by her husband. FBI records confirm Humphrey's presence in the hotel. Mrs. Humphreys says her husband summoned union leaders from across the country and ordered them to produce votes for John Kennedy.
People came in from New Orleans and Kansas City and southern Illinois and Missouri, and Murray had conferences with them and told them, do this.
Do this, Mrs. Humphreys says, means arranging for the unions to deliver votes to Kennedy.
Precisely. That was the gist of it. And I thought the election was a foregone conclusion, and I made a joke. Well, now that it's all set, can I go out to Vegas and put down a nice big bet and make myself some money? And he blew a stack. It was supposed to be a big secret, you know. I mean, no one was supposed to know what was going on with the outfit.
The Kennedys descended on Washington. For the first time in decades, young children roamed the halls and the grounds of the White House. The press was granted unprecedented access to the first family. All the Kennedys, sisters, brothers, even the parents became subjects of intense national interest. Robert Kennedy achieved a special status. The president appointed his own brother as his attorney general. There was talk that Robert Kennedy would be his brother's successor, that the Kennedys would become a political dynasty. Joseph Kennedy's dream had become a reality. Jacqueline Kennedy, the president's young wife, had played only a small role in the campaign, but once in the White House, she emerged as a woman of remarkable intelligence and grace. Americans were smitten.
There was something about the White House in that period. It was just a charged atmosphere. And it was more than just the beautiful Mrs. Kennedy or the handsome president or something. There was something about the White House that was glamorous.
They gave wonderful parties full of joyous spirit. And it was hard to believe that you were where you were, which was in the president's mansion. He had this country wrapped up in a way that I haven't seen it wrapped up since that time.
Let me tell you, it was fun. I mean, it was a world that we'd never seen, and they were so glamorous, and they had all of these wonderful guests to the White House, so that the president's personal dimensions, his life around the White House, all of that stuff became terribly important to us.
Stories about the Kennedys were everywhere, in magazines and on television, creating an enduring image of the Kennedy presidency that would be remembered as Camelot. But for some who worked inside the White House, the image did not ring true.
The first night or so I was there, someone took me aside and said that it's a good idea to keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth shut, because you're going to see a lot of stuff that doesn't belong outside the agent's information.
The Secret Service saw another side of Camelot, the dark side. 4 of them have chosen to speak for the first time.
We protected him readily with our lives if we had to. But there were times when he would go into private gatherings and private activities where I felt that he opened himself to danger, to hazard, and things that weren't very mightily not becoming the President of the United States, to say the least.
He was like a rough-cut diamond you just dug out of the dirt. If you cut it or strike it, you see one facet which makes you want to go out and fall under a car for him and love and admire him. And you see another facet that would make you not want to ever associate with him off the job in a bar or a restaurant or spend time, certainly not let him babysit your sister.
Agents report that the president often spent private time with young women on the White House staff. 2 of them were secretaries, known by the nicknames Fiddle and Faddle.
Fiddle and Faddle joined the Kennedy campaign in Los Angeles, and after he was elected, they were assigned to work in the White House, but it became apparent that they were there to be scooped up and taken into the pool at noon with JFK, and the term we heard, they would go skinny dipping with Jack, and they appeared to be the sole afternoon entertainment for the president. And occasionally one of the White House staff members would take 1 or 2 of them upstairs when the president was up there. But this never happened when Jacqueline Kennedy was in town or when she was in the White House.
One time, warning didn't come to the White House that Mrs. Kennedy was actually on her way. And just in the nick of time, the agent in charge was able to run into the pool and warn the president. And the door opened and people scattered. And as he ran out, he was holding a Bloody Mary in his hand, and I happened to be on the post there, and he said, "Here, take this." He didn't know what to do with it, and so I took it, and upstairs he went, and everybody parted, and everybody left, so that she didn't know. I never, in my real mind, figured that for the 2 years I was there, that she really didn't know what's going on. It would have been impossible, but strange situation. Miss Camelot, you don't rock the boat.
I'm not sure how fully Jackie knew of the extent to which he was womanizing. She probably knew that he was doing some. And I thought that it was a shame because she was an awfully nice girl. And he liked her. In fact, he made many admiring comments about her. Plus the fact that I didn't see why. I mean, Jackie had been more than enough of a wife. She had been a great deal of an asset to him. And I thought he really doesn't have any, he's not being mistreated at all by his wife. Why should he be looking elsewhere? But I fault his father for a great deal of this. His father had established apparently mistresses in different areas and got around in Hollywood, and certainly without Mrs. Kennedy by his side. So this womanizing was really a dreadful legacy that he left to his boys, I think.
One of the things I remember about Old Man Joe was in Palm Beach about 1956. Senator Kennedy's mother invited Lyndon and Ms. Johnson and myself to lunch at their home in Palm Beach. And we were just ready, you know, for coffee and dessert. Here comes Old Man Joe Kennedy with the most gorgeous-looking little French girl you've ever seen. And he's got his golf bag with him, and he doesn't say boo or damn you or nothing. He just takes her and goes right upstairs in the bedroom. So that was astonishing to me that he could be that crude and rude to, you know, bring an 18-year-old girl, and I understand later that she was his caddy that he brought over from France.
John Kennedy grew up as a privileged son of this extremely rich man, and that degree of wealth creates its own morality. As a matter of fact, once I was doing a piece for the Old Life on Kennedy's reading habits, and kind of an afterthought, we asked him about his 10 favorite books. And without hesitating, he said, Melbourne's my favorite book. I'd never heard of Melbourne. Well, this is the story of Lord Melbourne, who was one of Queen Victoria's prime ministers. And it was a story about the young aristocracy that ruled the world. And all through the book are stories about these young aristocrats who gave their lives in military campaigns or devoted themselves to Parliament, who held the ideal of empire and national honor above all else, served, but on the weekends, when they went to their country estates, it was broken field running through the bedrooms. I mean, they've swapped wives, they've slept with others, all of that sort of thing, but then when they came back to town at the end of the weekend, they were these upright, honorable leaders of the empire, ready to die for queen and country, ready to orate, and they were brilliant people, these young people. I think, when I got through the book, I remember I saw Kennedy once, and I said, listen, now I know you better than anything. He said, what do you mean? I said, I read that. I said, that tells me more about you than anything else. And he just laughed.
Like his father before him, John Kennedy was drawn to Hollywood. 30 years earlier, Joseph Kennedy had carried on an affair with one of the biggest stars of the day, Gloria Swanson. President Kennedy had the same ambitions.
I understand JFK's fascination with Hollywood because, you know, like Willie Sutton, Rob Banks, because that's where the money is. This is where the beautiful girls are, you know, and that's why JFK loved it out here.
The president's Hollywood social life centered around his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, husband of his sister Pat.
Peter Lawford was a popular figure in Hollywood. He wasn't a big star, but when Kennedy became president, Peter was, after all, his brother-in-law, and if the president said he was coming to town, he'd like to be introduced to such and such a lady, why, Peter was only too happy to introduce this or that movie star to the president. In a way, it was a little glow of power that reflected on Peter.
The president was a frequent guest at the Lawfords' Los Angeles home. Another frequent guest was the most famous actress in the world, Marilyn Monroe. The president's affair with Monroe was not a secret in Hollywood, and it posed the risk of scandal.
We knew about Marilyn Monroe's relationship with Jack Kennedy because it was our job to make sure that no one else knew about it. In those days, it was a much smaller town in Hollywood than it is now. There were only a couple of reporters. There was Vernon Scott and Jim Bacon, people like that, who she knew very well, all of whom knew about the Kennedys' association with her. But in those days, you did not attack a sitting president.
One time, we were at a party at Peter's, and we were all waiting for the president to come because we'd seen Marilyn show up. Well, it went on until about 11:30 or midnight, and the president still had not made an appearance. And finally, the party began breaking up, and I asked Peter, why wasn't the president here? He said, oh, he's come and gone. I loved the irony of having all the press there, not all the press, but a lot of us, and having the president come in on an assignation and leave without us knowing about it.
On May the 19th, 1962, Monroe performed at a gala birthday celebration for the president at New York's Madison Square Garden. Jacqueline Kennedy did not attend.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. I can now retire from politics after having had Happy Birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way.
The president's obvious appreciation of Marilyn Monroe did more than raise the risk of exposing their affair. She had come to expect a larger role in the president's life.
What happened was that she began to ask for opportunity to come to Washington, come to the White House, that sort of thing. And so that's when Jack asked me to see what I could do to help him in that respect by talking to her. I then got a fellow named Bill Thompson, whom Jack Kennedy liked very much. So he got Bill to go talk to Marilyn Monroe about putting a bridle on herself and on her mouth and that sort of thing, and not talking too much because it was getting to be a story around the country.
As you well know, that could have been the biggest scandal of all time. President of the United States, the #1 sex symbol, having an affair. A married president of the United States, yeah.
The mounting concern that Monroe was talking too much and too freely was heightened by her long history of emotional problems. For many years, she'd relied on psychiatrists and other doctors to stabilize her life. At one point, her mental condition required hospitalization. No treatment, however, had been effective in reducing her chronic dependence on drugs and alcohol.
She was drinking very heavily and popping pills at the same time. I think they were barbiturates. And I said, Marilyn, I said, you know, when you put those two together, it's lethal. And she says, well, it hadn't killed me yet. And that was 5 days before she died.
Monroe died of a drug overdose sometime during the night of August 4th, 1962. Just hours later, Peter Lawford called the president with the news. John Kennedy was spending the weekend visiting his father at the family compound in Hyannis. The president never commented publicly about Monroe's death. It's important to remember when reviewing John Kennedy's presidency how dangerous the world was then. We lived under the constant threat of a global nuclear war. Together, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough weapons to destroy all of humanity. And yet, at this time of maximum danger, the leader of the free world was taking risks that jeopardized his presidency.
In 1961, the Soviet Union was flexing its muscle. It had proved to us they can build hydrogen bombs. Sent Sputnik into the air and scared everybody. So here was John Kennedy, worried about Khrushchev's speech about the right of the Soviet Union to foment revolution around the world, worried about 4 million Soviet soldiers under arms that were staring across Europe. So you had this nation, the United States, the most powerful, the most wealthy on earth, but suddenly questions.
Each day the crises multiply. Each day their solution grows more difficult. Each day we draw nearer the hour of maximum danger.
The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a global power struggle, each seeking to weaken its adversary by every possible means. With armies, with political threats and propaganda, and with spies. Spies whose mission it was to penetrate the inner workings of the opposing government. One technique was to compromise a targeted official by exploiting a personal weakness. In the Kennedy White House, members of the Secret Service were concerned that the president's private behavior made him a potential target.
Many people came to the White House who did not know who they were. He had a tendency to surround himself with ladies sometimes that were a little worrisome.
These women were of questionable character.
Most of the other Secret Service agents and myself were worried about the fact that the Russians or communists or any people like that could bring in a ringer, so to speak.
We didn't know if these women were carrying listening devices, if they had syringes that carried some type of poison, or if they had Pentax cameras that would photograph the president for blackmail.
Possibility of blackmail and things like that are astounding. Who knows? I never knew the name of one of the outsiders.
One night in Seattle, we took the president up to the Olympic Hotel to secure for the night. And as we were doing that, a high-ranking law enforcement official from King County had come out of the elevator with 2 prostitutes and was walking down toward the president's door. And a senior staff member came out of the president's suite, thanked him for bringing the girls up, and took them into the suite. So one of the policemen, the lieutenant, asked me, he said, does this go on all the time? And I didn't know what to say, and I said, well, we travel during the day, this only happens at night.
Prostitution, that's illegal. Procurement is illegal. And if you have a procurer with prostitutes paraded in front of you, then as a sworn law enforcement officer, you're asking yourself, well, what do they think of us?
You were on an elite assignment. It was the most elite assignment in the Secret Service. And you were there watching an elevator or a door because the president was inside with two hookers.
And this continued constantly. It was just not once every 6 months, not every New Year's Eve, but it was a regular thing. And I remember one time I was with the president in Honolulu. During that trip, he went to Battleship Arizona and a few other things. The president arrived at the residence about on time. I'd say within 10 minutes, a staff member arrived in a car escorting two ladies, and they marched in the house also. This was sort of the usual routine in many stops. And a colonel of the Marines turned to me and said, who are they? And I turned to him, I said, well, they're secretaries, and I assume there's some work the president wants done this evening. We protected the president in many different ways. But the Honolulu episode made me angry. It didn't make me angry. We're talking about the President of the United States. And I'm not a holier-than-thou guy, but he just shouldn't be doing this in public like this. There was no regard for who was there. The Marine colonel was there. He knew what, what's going on. Other people were there. The Navy people were in the house. Cooks were in the house. He's the president. He's the boss. I didn't like it, but what you going to do about it? Nothing.
The concerns of the Secret Service went beyond the dangers that prostitutes might pose. The agents learned that the president was using dangerous medication.
While I was working at the White House, there was a doctor, I believe his name was Jacobson, who we used to call Dr. Feelgood. He'd periodically come to the White House with a case full of medications that possibly could have been harmful.
Dr. Max Jacobson had a loyal following among celebrities in New York and Hollywood. He injected his patients with what he called vitamin shots that boosted their energy and confidence.
We learned that Jacobson would inject himself too. So sometimes when he came to the White House, his speech was slurred, and he was going up to the floor or go into the pool room to give the president a shot.
We assumed because he was a doctor and had permission to go to see the president that it was okay for him to go in.
Someone took out a sample of what he was giving the president, and the sample mysteriously got to Bobby Kennedy, who had it analyzed, and it turned out to be amphetamines.
Official logs show that Dr. Jacobson made more than 30 visits to the White House.
Of course, both Russia and the United States at that time had the thermonuclear bomb. And if the president turns around and starts having hallucinations, he was one reach from the red phone on his desk when he was taking these injections. In fact, when he was meeting Khrushchev at the summit meeting, Feelgood went with him expressly to keep the injections going to the president.
The president depended on Jacobson during his first summit meeting with Khrushchev, and he continued to depend on the doctor's treatment through some of the most difficult periods of his presidency. Both Robert Kennedy and the official White House physician Janet Travell tried to convince the president he should stop seeing Jacobson, but they failed. According to Jacobson's records, he last saw the president in Florida as he was preparing for the November trip to Dallas. Max Jacobson's medical license was revoked in 1975 after one of his patients died from acute amphetamine poisoning.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
One event above all others convinced Americans that John Kennedy was a capable and decisive leader: the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 7 days in the fall of 1962, the world stood on the brink of annihilation. The Soviet Union had secretly installed missiles in Cuba, the site of the first communist government in the Western Hemisphere. These missiles could carry nuclear weapons. They could hit American cities within minutes. The discovery of the missiles plunged the administration into crisis. Kennedy and his advisors considered taking military action to destroy the missiles, but any confrontation with Soviet forces in Cuba could lead to an all-out war. Kennedy placed the Army and the Air Force on high alert. He ordered the Navy to blockade Cuba. Americans feared that a nuclear war was imminent. In secret, however, Kennedy struck a deal with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. America would remove its missiles based in Turkey in exchange for a Soviet withdrawal of the missiles in Cuba. Publicly, Kennedy pledged only that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. The threat of war was averted. To Americans, this was John Kennedy's finest hour. Most Americans have always blamed the missile crisis entirely on Nikita Khrushchev. What virtually no Americans knew at the time was that Khrushchev, who was dedicated to the expansion of Soviet power, also installed the missiles in Cuba as a response to what the U.S. government had been doing ever since Fidel Castro seized power in 1959. The Central Intelligence Agency under Kennedy's predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, had begun planning to overthrow the Castro regime. The CIA had targeted Castro himself for assassination, and the agency had recruited members of the American Mafia to organize Castro's murder. When John Kennedy took office in January 1961, he implemented the plans to overthrow the Castro regime. And for the duration of his presidency, he waged a secret war against Cuba.
The Kennedys were just absolutely obsessed with getting rid of the Castro regime. We were under tremendous pressure to get something done. And they didn't care what ground rules were. They didn't have any ground rules as far as I knew. We were supposed to do what we had to do, and period.
The CIA had recruited 2 members of the Chicago Mafia to arrange Castro's murder, Johnny Rosselli and his immediate boss, Sam Giancana, Kennedy's secret ally in the 1960 election. Giancana had his own reason to want Castro removed. Castro had closed Cuba's mob-controlled gambling casinos. The casinos had thrived under the corrupt dictatorship of Castro's predecessor. Robert Mayhew, a former FBI agent who'd done work for the CIA, was asked to be the agency's contact to Giancana.
The plan was that Sam Giancana, particularly Sam Giancana, had presumably connections in Cuba that would be helpful in an outright assassination by weapon or by poison.
Historians have disputed whether President Kennedy ever knew about the Mafia plots, but there is a trail of evidence that connects him directly to Sam Giancana's efforts. The link, once again, was Kennedy's lover, Judith Campbell. According to Campbell, Kennedy used her to carry secret information to Giancana.
Sometimes when I went to the White House, he would ask me to take some information to Sam, and I knew that they dealt with the elimination of Castro, and that Sam and Johnny had been hired by the CIA. I knew all of that. That's what Jack explained to me in the very beginning when he asked me, would I do this for him?
We didn't know about Judy Campbell. Nobody knew about Judy Campbell.
Andrew Postal and David Bouchon discovered Campbell's links to the president and Giancana. They were lawyers for a Senate committee that investigated the CIA's plots against Castro. They have never before spoken publicly.
Not only did we discover that this was a woman who was a person who was in contact with the White House by telephone records, but this was a person who was in contact with the White House simultaneously almost, certainly contemporaneously, with her contact with the mafia figures who were in fact, lo and behold, the people who were trying to kill Castro.
According to a senior CIA official, Richard Bissell, the CIA expected Castro to be assassinated before the invasion of Cuba.
The CIA explained that it was necessary for the invasion to be a success, that Castro be disposed of. And the assassination plot was to take place, hopefully, just prior to the invasion. Hopefully.
April the 17th, 1961. American-trained Cuban exiles landed on a remote stretch of Cuba's coastline at a place called the Bay of Pigs. Within hours, they encountered heavily armed Cuban troops. More than 1,000 of the invaders were captured. 114 were killed. Fidel Castro himself was still very much alive. The Mafia's murder plot had failed.
As far as we knew, the Mafia plans were attempted. The poisoned pills were presumably delivered to that contact, and it is that contact that we learned later had feared for life and run away.
Countries around the world immediately condemned the invasion. The president took the blame.
I know that many of you have further questions about Cuba. We are continuing consultations with other American republics. I do not think that any useful national purpose would be served by my going further into the Cuban question this morning.
Why is it not useful, sir, for us to explore with you the real facts behind this or our motivations?
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I think the facts of the matter will come out in due time.
The history I learned as a kid was that the Bay of Pigs was the end of a story.
I'm confining myself to my statement.
The historical facts were completely different. Leading up to the Bay of Pigs and substantially escalated after the Bay of Pigs, the United States ran an undeclared war against Cuba.
After the Bay of Pigs, the president put his brother Robert in charge of all covert operations against Cuba.
The administration wanted Castro out, but the president, he had a lot of other things on his mind. So Bobby decided that Castro had rendered a personal insult to the Kennedy family by the action at the Bay of Pigs. And so Bobby led the charge, and he put steady, unrelenting pressure on the agency to do something about Castro.
Dick Bissell, who was then the deputy director for plans CIA, the cloak and dagger part of the building, he'd been chewed out in the cabinet room of the White House by the president and the attorney general for not getting off his ass and doing something about getting rid of Castro and the Castro regime. And that's almost a direct quote, if I'm not mistaken. And when I asked him what it meant, he said, use your imagination. He says, there are no holds barred, whatever you come up with. And you can arrest a man, you can put him out on an island in the middle of the Atlantic, like they did with Napoleon, that's fine. He's out of the way. But the easiest way, of course, is to kill somebody. And we felt that that's what they wanted, and nobody said so in so many words, and nobody's about to in those kinds of operations.
The U.S. government arranged other assassination attempts, staged more raids against Cuba, committed more acts of sabotage, and trained forces for a second invasion. These actions fueled Soviet and Cuban fears and contributed to the missile crisis. But even the trauma of the missile crisis did not put an end to the attacks against Cuba. Kennedy continued to press his secret war throughout the last year of his presidency. On the final day of the president's life, November 22, 1963, the CIA met secretly in Paris with a Cuban official named Rolando Cubella. He was there to plot yet another attempt on Fidel Castro's life. At the end of 1961, the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, had suffered a stroke that left him crippled and unable to speak. Robert Kennedy was now his brother's most powerful protector. Robert Kennedy was a different man than his father. The Attorney General had built his reputation as an outspoken antagonist of organized crime. We have found no evidence that Robert Kennedy did anything to relieve the pressure on Sam Giancana. In fact, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, encouraged the FBI's investigation. And the investigation would eventually lead to his own brother. In 1962 in Chicago, the outfit was still under siege. The FBI's organized crime unit had increased from 5 to 70 agents. The Attorney General himself had visited Chicago to encourage their efforts against the mob.
The mob hated Bobby Kennedy. They felt that they were double-crossed. They felt that they had some brownie points that they'd made by acceding to the demands of the Kennedy administration. And they had the FBI, with no hold barred, continuing their investigation.
Giancana complained about that frequently. He claimed that he did a lot to help Kennedy. And nobody was grateful. Giancana thought that he deserved some gratitude for doing what he did. And nothing would seem to turn off the investigations.
The FBI's hidden microphones in Chicago recorded Giancana's anger. Even his friend Frank Sinatra, who'd been close to both Kennedy brothers, was unable to win any favors from the Attorney General. Robert Kennedy saw Sinatra's association with the president as a political liability. Sinatra's friendships with mobsters could embarrass the administration. In March 1962, John Kennedy planned to spend a weekend in Palm Springs at Sinatra's home. Robert Kennedy convinced his brother he should change his plans.
They said it was due to security factors. You know, it was some lame excuse, and Dad knew it was Bobby and said so to his inner circle. And it was pretty clear that Bobby was looking to sever any ties with the very people that helped get his brother in office. And it was a very low point in my dad's life. He felt very hurt, very let down, very disappointed. He never blamed Jack for it. But I think he thought that there was a betrayal.
Robert Kennedy was determined to protect his brother, to prevent any damaging revelations about the president's secret life. But inside the government, there was one man with a unique ability to uncover secrets, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was now following a growing trail of evidence that the president was carelessly leaving behind. Hoover had run the FBI for nearly 4 decades. He had acquired in his files confidential information about the most prominent figures in Washington.
J. Edgar Hoover had enormous power. He knew who people had slept with. He knew where the money was. He knew whether people were sleeping with people of the same sex. And no political figure in this country could take Hoover on directly. And I think that the Kennedys wanted to fire him. But he was the keeper of the secrets. He had the files.
Hoover pressed the investigation of Sam Giancana and his associates, which inevitably led the FBI to Judith Campbell. Hoover's discovery of this 27-year-old woman and her affair with the president put the president on the defensive and changed her life forever. In Los Angeles, Judith Campbell was interrogated by FBI agents about her contacts with the Chicago boss.
The FBI came to visit me, and they treated me with such disrespect. I finally just told them to leave. And I called Jack right away. And he always said, he always had the same pat answer for me. He'd always say, don't worry about them. I mean, even after they were harassing me so terribly and following me everywhere, questioning all my friends. And he would always say, don't worry about it. You have nothing to be afraid of. you've never done anything wrong in your life, and you know Sam works for us.
Following the trail left by her phone records, the FBI discovered that Campbell spoke frequently with the White House. More than 70 phone calls and several personal visits to Kennedy were recorded in official White House logs.
I believe that the mafia plots involving Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli and the involvement of Judy Campbell Exner became one of the most critical bits of information that J. Edgar Hoover acquired during the Kennedy administration.
On March the 22nd, 1962, the President and Hoover had a rare private meeting. Hoover came to the meeting armed with damaging information that could expose John Kennedy's links to the Mafia. Andrew Postal and David Bouchon examined the briefing memos that the FBI prepared for the director.
In fact, he asked for briefing papers containing the information about the President's relationship with this woman, that woman's relationship with organized crime figures who were being used by the CIA.
This gave Hoover an opportunity to lay out for the President a story which involved him in official sanctioned assassination attempts, involvement with the mob, and a great many things which I think the Kennedys were not prepared to have the director use publicly.
After the meeting with Hoover, Jack called me, and he said, go to your mother's and call me. And then I called him back, and he said that he didn't think my phone was safe when I called him back from my mother's. And he said that he had just had this meeting with Hoover, and he called him an SOB, and he said he said he tried to use, you know, this information as leverage. You know, he said really his attitude was the gall of the man to try to intimidate him. He was livid. He was absolutely livid.
We later learned that Bobby did tell the President that he had to lay off Judith Exner. He had to stay away from her, and as a result, things did quiet down considerably as a result of Mr. Hoover knowing of that information and furnishing it to Bobby. So it did have a healthy effect in that regard, but we also later learned that it didn't cease completely. He did continue to see her.
Jack was never concerned about the surveillance, but it became really frightening. They were living across the street from me, two FBI men, and watching me 24 hours a day. And I told Jack that I was very troubled about the FBI surveillance and his treating it lightly. And he did say a couple of times that he would talk to Bobby and see what they could do about it. But it never seemed to me that anything was done.
The FBI's intense interest in Campbell continued. She became more and more fearful. And in March 1963, she confided in a friend, Johnny Grant, a well-known Los Angeles television reporter.
I met Judy quite by accident in the lobby of the Riviera Hotel, I think around noon. And there was a dramatic change in her appearance. I mean, she had aged, and I said, oh, my Lord, what happened to this poor soul? And then she told me a little bit. She said that J. Edgar Hoover was giving her a bad time. And she said that she was seeing Jack and Sam. And I remember asking her, I said, well, does one know about the other? And she said, yes, Jack had encouraged it. And she went on to tell me later that she was the courier between Jack and Sam. And she was scared to death.
Emotionally, I wasn't holding up very well. And I really almost had the feeling that decisions were being made as to whether I should live or die. For some reason, I sensed I was in terrible danger. And I don't know whether it was... I never felt danger from Sam, but I felt the situation maybe that I had found myself in, that I had put my life at risk.
The FBI continued to investigate Campbell even after the president's death.
I still care for the man that I knew, yes. I understand him. I don't respect a lot that he did, but then who of us have not made terrible mistakes in our lives and done things that, you know, that aren't exactly proper? And I think he was so influenced by his father that he couldn't live any other way. I'm only sad, so sad, that he wasn't wiser. He was so bright.
So did President Kennedy's involvement with Judith Campbell make him vulnerable to blackmail? This FBI document discovered during our reporting raises that question. 2 FBI agents tell of watching a break-in at Campbell's Los Angeles apartment while she was out. The agents did nothing to stop it, but they did trace the intruder's car. It belonged to a man named I.B. Hale. Hale was the former FBI agent who was now a security chief for one of the nation's largest defense contractors, the General Dynamics Corporation. And 3 months after this break-in, General Dynamics was awarded the largest defense contract in American history to build the TFX fighter. But General Dynamics had not been the Pentagon's choice. The decision by the Kennedy administration to give General Dynamics the contract was so unexpected and so controversial that the Senate launched an investigation. But J. Edgar Hoover never told the Senate committee about the break-in at Judith Campbell's and the possibility that information obtained in her apartment was used to blackmail the president. The committee was still conducting hearings when the president went to Dallas in November 1963.